Well, as I think we've said a couple times here already this morning, we are in week 2 of a series called Life Hacks, and this is a series where we're really journeying through kind of the big concepts that we find in the book of Proverbs, and we're doing that throughout this entire month. And really, if I were to sum it down or bring it down to just one word, it would be wisdom. We want to know, how can we live the most wise lives possible? And in a world where we know there are an awful lot of people with an awful lot of takes and opinions, whether it's the Cosmo magazine you see at the grocery store, it's a social media influencer, the voices on the news, or wherever, there are an awful lot of people with an awful lot of takes on how we should do this thing. But again, I don't know about you. I'll just speak for myself. I've recognized that when I start to follow that stuff, when I start to align myself, when I start to think that has some wisdom or bearing on the decisions that I should make, it doesn't always lead down the best paths. But when I look at, okay, maybe God has some truth that I can live by. Maybe God has a little bit more insight or wisdom that I should align myself with. Man, everything changes. I find I live a lot wiser of a life. So that's the idea behind this entire series. Last week, we started essentially with this. We said, if you want to be truly wise, chase after Jesus. And as cliche as that may sound, like that's the Sunday school answer, right? Jesus. Jesus is always the right answer. But really, truly, if you want to be wise, chase after Jesus. He's a pretty good example, a pretty good place to start. And we went through last week and we looked at all these different New Testament passages that highlight this and show this and really just elevate Jesus as the wisest man who ever lived. Wiser even than the guy that we're reading his writings throughout this entire month, Solomon, who is sort of this mythological and maybe accurate depiction of wisdom, and certainly is wise and certainly does have a lot to share with us in the book of Proverbs. But Jesus is even like a notch above that. So again, if you missed last week, that's kind of the foundation. Today, we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to talk more specific. Like, are there certain principles? Are there certain questions? Are there certain ways that we should align ourselves to be people who are making wise decisions? And so if you have a Bible, open up with me. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 4 here this morning. And we're going to start here. We're going to read the first 9 verses of that chapter, and then we're going to look at and just kind of dive into a couple different stories about a pretty significant character that we find in the Old Testament, and moments where he made some wise decisions and other moments where he didn't, and what we can learn from that. But let's start here. Proverbs 4, verses 1 through 9. It says this: "Listen, my sons, to a father's instruction. Pay attention and gain understanding. I give you sound learning, so do not forsake my teaching. For I too was a son to my father, still tender and cherished by my mother. Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart. Keep my commands, and you will live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget my words or turn away from them. Do not forsake wisdom, and she will protect you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. Cherish her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will give you a garland to grace your head and present you with a glorious crown." And so here's what we find in these first 9 verses. And if you were to keep reading all the way through chapter 4, basically the general idea is this: do everything you can to live with as much wisdom as you can. Chase after it, run after it, pursue it with everything you have, because generally speaking, your life will probably be a lot better if you were to live within the confines of godly wisdom. But here's what I noticed this week, especially as I was prepping and I was sort of poring over this text, I was looking at this, there's this little mention, like we peeled back the layer just a little bit. Yes, the general idea of the text is chase after wisdom, do everything you can to make that a priority in your life. But then there's this sort of these subtle words that pop up here right in the middle. I'll just read them again. It says, do not forget wisdom. Do not forget my words. It says this as well, or don't turn away from wisdom. It also says this. It says, don't forsake wisdom. And I started to think, okay, we should chase after, we should pursue, we should do everything we can to run after being as wise as we possibly can. We should lean on God's word and lean on Jesus as we pursue all that. But I started to think, well, what does it look like then to forsake wisdom, to turn from wisdom? What does it look like to forget wisdom? and started to think through, like, what are the big things in our lives that if we were going to be really honest with ourselves, these are the things that when it comes to pursuing wisdom, these are the things that more often than not kind of we shoot ourselves in the foot with it. Like when we do these things, we forget to be wise. When we do these things, we forsake wisdom. When we do these things, we turn away from wisdom. And I think it comes down to, I just came up with 4 things that I wanted to share with you to get us going here this morning. I think the first thing is this. If you want to be someone who is really, truly living your life with wisdom, I think the first way that we shoot ourselves in the foot is we live with impulse. Anyone ever find yourself giving in to an impulse and then you step out of it for a moment and you say, oh, dang, that was really dumb. I'm kind of an impulsive person. I tend to be an individual who I have to catch myself often. And as I'm getting a little bit older, I think I'm getting better with it, but I still have this tendency every now and then. I'll just act because there's an urge or there's an opportunity. Like I'll just impulse, let's go. But it's usually not the best way to be wise, is it? Here's another one I thought I'd throw at you. It's emotion. It's easy to be unwise if we're letting emotion drive the car. And emotion's a good thing. Love, joy, happiness, all of that, it's so beautiful. And it's so nice to just feel those warm feelings. But then on the flip side, emotions, man, we see the power of like loneliness is a powerful emotion. So many people, I see so many people just bow down to that emotion. Just, oh, I'm feeling lonely, so I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to reach out to this person, I'm going to make this bad decision because then I can ignore this feeling that I have, but it's going to lead to a whole bunch more trouble. Or fear. Fear is one of those emotions that it's like, it's there for a reason, but fear so often, it keeps us from going here, making the wise decision because I'm scared. Again, emotion isn't bad, but when we're letting emotion drive the car, it doesn't lead to a whole lot of wise decisions. I think the third thing that we see shoots us in the foot a little bit, we're struggling here with wisdom. I think it's this, it's a lack of boundaries. I think it's easy to make bad decisions when we don't have any boundaries or guardrails in our lives, when we're just kind of flying from here. I got this impulse, I got this emotion, I got this thing that I'm just going to do, and I'm just going to go, and all right, here we go here. And there's no boundaries, there's no checks or balances or people in our life who say, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe that's not such a good idea. We didn't put anything in place by ourselves to keep ourselves from making bad decisions. Like, boundaries are so important. And then finally, I think it's this. Again, to just piggyback off of what I said last week, I think Jesus isn't a priority. I think that's another way that we can make unwise decisions. It's when we just let everything get out of whack and all of a sudden this thing, Jesus, this God, Jesus, who's supposed to be the one that we live our lives by, and he's the wisest man who ever lived, and he's the one that we should align everything with. When we're not prioritizing him, it's really easy to say, well, this impulse is okay. Well, this emotion is fine. Well, this thing is, I don't need guardrails. I don't need boundaries. I'm going to do what I need to do. And more often than not, here's what I find, is when we live within these 4 things, and we're letting these 4 things just drive everything we do, and this is how we function, it leads pretty often to heartache and pain and regret. Again, some of that's there for a reason. I'm not saying it's all bad, but like impulse and emotion, I'm not saying it's all bad. But when that's what's driving everything we do, it could be scary. And I think there's some of us, again, if your life is anything like mine, I think there's some of us in the room that if you were to be honest, I keep saying that this morning because I think it's a pretty big thing in this conversation, but if you were to be honest with yourself, there is some moment in your life that you would point back and you would say, yeah, that was impulse that led that, and it led to all this pain. Or maybe you're sitting right now in the wake of some really difficult circumstances, really difficult stuff because you let emotion drive the car, you let emotion handle it, you didn't have guardrails here, and you did something really stupid, and now you're kind of just sitting in it, and it stinks. But here's what I'm not going to do this morning. I'm not beating you up for that. We're not going to crucify you for that, okay? We get it. That's life. We make bad decisions from time to time. But here's what I do want to do with the rest of our time this morning is I want to give you some parameters that I think will help you to make wise decisions. Before we get to that, though, let's look at an example of someone who maybe let emotion and impulse take it a little too far. It's a guy named David. Many of us, you know this story, and we're going to look at actually two stories from David's life. The first one is probably the more popular one. It's the one that many of us know. I think I taught on it a few months ago even. But it's the story of David and Bathsheba. And the story goes like this. David is on his rooftop, or he's on his balcony. He's looking out, and he sees a woman bathing. And she's beautiful. Bathsheba is her name, and she is beautiful. Now, David does not know Bathsheba. They don't have history. They have no connection. She's certainly not his wife or any of that. David just sees her, and David, being mighty King David, the king of Israel, David says, I want her. All right, so what do we find right off the bat? Impulse. There's an urge. There's a naked woman. And I've heard people sometimes they'll say like, well, come on, what's Bathsheba doing? She's trying to entice him, right? I mean, come on, she's bathing. She's on her roof, okay? Like she's not thinking there's gonna be some creeper up on a balcony looking down at her, all right? And again, let's understand the context of the time, that usually there are a lot of people living in your house. Let's understand this is a crowded city. It's not easy to find a place. Like she's like, I bet I could go on my roof. And she goes up there, thinking she has privacy. David sees her. David says, yeah, I want her. He says, with this impulse to whoever those individuals would be, his servants, hey, bring her to me. They bring her. So now we find David has no checks, no balances, no guardrails, none of that, okay? He's the king. He gets what he wants. So David says, I want that. They say, yes, sir, absolutely, sir. No one says, actually, David, she's married to somebody. Actually, the guy she's married to is really loyal to you and is actually on the battlefields right now, fighting for you. Are you sure you want it? No one says that. Just, yes, sir, David, absolutely, we'll get her. They bring her up. David and Bathsheba have relations. What happens? We know how the story goes. She gets pregnant. Now, this impulse and this lack of guardrails has led into this moment where David is like, crap. We got to cover this up. Now he's thinking emotionally. He's trying to figure out, okay, I guess here's what we could do. I got it. And he goes to whoever this person would be. He says, I need you to summon Bathsheba's wife because, yes, she's married. I know it's really stupid, but can you just bring him back? Just bring him back from the battlefield. Bring him back to me. And so they bring Bathsheba's wife back, and he meets with David. He doesn't know all this other shady stuff has gone down, and David's like, hey, man, it's good to see you. Here, have a glass of wine. Hey, have another glass of wine. You know what? Here, just if you would, just sit right here, open your mouth. I'm going to get this barrel here, and it's got a bunch of wine, and we're just going to pour. And David's trying to get this dude like drunk, like really drunk, and his idea, and he succeeds in it, but his idea is, now I'm going to send you back. You're going to go be with your wife. Maybe you won't even remember all this, but then you can say that it's your child, and we'll just go from there. But this guy, Bathsheba's husband, is so noble. He's just a genuinely good man. Even in his drunken state, he looks at David. He said, I couldn't. You want me to go back and be with my wife? I couldn't do that. All my buddies are out on the battlefield. They don't get to be with their families right now. I couldn't do that. It's not right. I'll just find another place to crash. And again, David is like, what am I going to do here? And so he comes up with a plan. He puts David on the front lines, sends him back out to the battlefield, and he dies. And I can't help but think, and all this leads to is more heartache and more sorrow and more pain. He ends up taking Bathsheba as his wife, but it's just a bunch of mess. And I can't help but think, how much of the anguish and the pain and the cover-up, how much of that, if David had just stopped and said, I'm not going to live impulsively, I'm not going to give into this hurt, I'm not going to just let my emotion drive me, I'm going to be wise. Again, most of you in the room, that's not your story. You never summoned some woman from your palace and brought her up and did all that and had to cover it up, and that's not your story. But again, I bet there are most of us in the room, every single one of us, in some way, you have a story of, I made this decision, I messed up, and now I have to live in it. We're not going to sit in that. We're not beating you up for that. Jesus for all people, okay? But here's the hope, is that we can move forward. And we can move, and we don't have to create more of that. And so here's what I'm gonna do, is I'm gonna give you three concepts, I guess you'd say. It's actually two questions and one principle that I'm gonna share with you this morning on what I think, if you were to apply these to your life, I think it would help you to make better, more wise decisions. These are not original to me. I did not come up with these questions nor this concept. These are things that I borrowed from other pastors, mostly Andy Stanley and another guy named John, who I have a lot of respect for, but they're just so good. I just felt like this is just so good to relay. So let's start here. If you're a person who wants to make wise decisions, if you're tired of sitting in pain or heartache or whatever the junk that comes from all the whims, just crazy things that you've done, let's just start here. Ask yourself, what's the wise thing to do? If you have a big life decision that you're trying to navigate through, ask, before you take a step, before you do anything, what's the wise thing to do? If you have circumstances that are maybe just thrown at you, just quickly, just boom, and you have to ask, before you just impulsively or emotionally or just act out, what's the wise thing to do? And here's the question that when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, 15, 16, 17 years old, here's the question that me and my youth group friends were asking. I grew up in church. I went to youth group. I had a youth pastor I loved. And I can remember many times we would ask this question. We would say, and some of you asked this same question as well to different people in your life that you trusted, when you started to notice the opposite sex, maybe start dating, and you started to ask this question, how far is too far? You remember that question? Man, I remember we had lots of late night debates, me and my buddies trying to talk ourselves into maybe this is okay. And like how far can I go in my relationship with my boyfriend or my girlfriend or whatever? How far am I allowed to go physically with them before I have stepped over any sort of line, before I have made God mad, essentially? And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about this concept of what's the wise thing to do? And I was thinking about, it's kind of like this. Here's the problem with asking how far is too far. It's kind of like you're getting right to the edge. You're essentially saying, where's the line? And then, so now I'm going to, especially as like a 16-year-old kid, I'm going to get right up to that line. I'm going to get as close as I can to that line. But I'm going to try not to pass it. But then there might be an urge or like a gust of wind or something that hits, but like I'm just. And here's the problem. Think about this. If you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're an aunt or an uncle, or you just know of a child in your life, let's say you're at the Grand Canyon. I have a 6-year-old son. He's crazy. This is something he would do. He would be like, Dad, I want to get right up. And we're at the Grand Canyon. Here's what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't say, hey, how far do you think is too far, buddy? Like, what are you comfortable with? He's going to get right up there. He's going to go right to that. He's going to be like, No, I would be like, all right, here we go. 20 feet. Back here, don't even look. It might be a nice view, but you'll never know. We're safe. Back here. And let's take it beyond like purity and conversations we had as youth group kids. This is just kind of life, right? But when we start, the question doesn't always have to be, is it a sin or isn't it a sin? That's how we want to think so often, is black and white. Is it a sin or is it not? Sometimes the best question is it wise? And the wise thing is not to get right up here, right to the edge. I'm not stepping over. It's fine. I'm okay. What? Right? We're good. This is all right. I'll switch legs. We can all reach. I'm not. And it's just not wise. It's not the wise thing to do. I'll give you a couple of examples on how this may apply to your life. Let's say at your workplace, there is an incredibly attractive person. It is not a sin to think they are attractive, but you are happily married. Still, it's not a sin to think someone is attractive. People are attractive. Some people aren't. And so you have this person, you're happily married, you have this person that you work with, and you notice that they kind of start, looking at you every now and then. They kind of start, hey, they're talking to you every now and then. But you're happily married, you want to stay happily married. Now, here's what we could do in our mind is we could do these really stupid things where we could say, it's not a big deal if we just go out on a work lunch thing. That's not a sin. That's not a sin, but it's probably not wise, is it? It's not that big a deal if we, it's probably not that big a deal if we just, there's this corporate thing. It's out of town, and maybe we could just ride together in a car together. It's not a sin, but it's not wise. I'll give you another example. How about this? You're on a path towards sobriety. You are sober, but you are also an addict. It is a part of who you are. It is a life that you have lived, and it's a very real part. But you are in a place where you're saying, "I'm done with this," and you made some really big decisions in your life to every single day, one day at a time, to be sober. But you got this group of friends, and this is one of the big decisions that you had to make. Like that group of friends, the drinks are flying, they're having a good time. I just can't, I have to remove myself from those situations if I'm going to be wise, if I'm going to be sober. But fine, let's just pretend. Let's have fun here, okay? Let's say the Browns make the Super Bowl, okay? Let's be a little over the top. And let's say this group of friends, they just miss you. They haven't seen you in a while, and they're like, "Hey, could you just, like, why don't you just come hang with us? It's just a football game. We're just gonna have fun. It'll be fun." And you're like, it's just a football game. It's just, I can do it, right? But what's the wise thing to do? It's not a sin to go to their house and watch a football game. But what's the wise thing? And we could do this for a while. Sometimes the best question isn't, is it a sin or not? Sometimes the best question is it wise? Here's the second thing. I won't spend quite as much time on this because they kind of go hand in hand. But the second thing is this. Am I being honest with myself? Like, really? Have you ever done this? Have you ever lied to yourself to try to justify a thing that you knew probably wasn't right? I have. I don't know if I'm the only one. Like, I'll give another example. This isn't obviously my life, but I'll give another example. We do stuff like this. Emotion, right? Loneliness is a heavy emotion. And so you start to feel lonely. You're like, man, I'm between relationships, and I really wish that I could just be with someone. And so we'll lie to ourselves. Like maybe you'll go out with someone, and you're hanging out, and you see about 20 red flags right there at coffee, but you tell yourself you're just so lonely, and you're just like, but it's not that big a deal. It's just, it's not that big a deal. And you go to their house sometime, and you're again, this whole time you're just lying to yourself. You're trying to justify this because you just don't want to be lonely. So you're not being wise. You go over to their house, you notice they got like this door that goes down the basement, but there's like a padlock on it. You're like, that's kind of weird, but I'm just gonna ignore that. And there's like a shovel propped up next to the door and like some blood kind of trickling out from underneath the thing. And you're like, that's, but I'm just, no big deal. Like we'll just ignore things. We're like, it's fine, I'm sure it's nothing. We don't make wise decisions when we just follow impulse or emotion or whatever. You got to be honest with yourself. Really. And I'll say this as well. Often we can't do that. Often if we're going to just admit things, we can't do that. And so we have to have people in our lives who ask us honest questions. If you don't have that person, you should find that person, and they're going to annoy you sometimes because they're going to ask you hard questions. But it's for good. Finally, here's the last thing. I'll just move on. Here's the last thing I'll throw at you. It's a concept, many of us have heard, we use the phrase ASAP, right? And so we all know that means as soon as possible. We send out an email, as soon as possible. I need this, as soon as possible. Give this to me, blah, blah, blah. But recently I heard a really good way, kind of a flip of that concept. And I just love it. I just want to share this with you. It's this. Instead of saying as soon as possible, what if we considered as slow as possible? As slow as possible. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you shouldn't have drive. I'm not saying you shouldn't have ambition. I'm not saying you should just move annoyingly, sloth-like through every element of your life. That's not what I'm saying. But I will recognize this, and if you recognize this, that we live in a world where there's an awful lot of pressure. It feels like from a young age to perform. There's an awful lot. You got to know, like I feel like we put our kids on a learning track where they have to know what their career is, like in 6th grade or 7th grade now. And there's just this pressure as a society that we're mounting mounting on ourselves, we're mounting on our kids, we're just piling on. And it's just this pressure, like you have to get married by this time or else you're whatever. You have to have, your career path by the time you graduate high school. You have to have this and this and this. And it's just like we're all kind of just racing through because because there's this pressure and I have to perform and I have to be perceived a certain way and I have to be someone. So I'm gonna start dating someone and all my peers are doing this and they're dating relationships. So I'm just gonna hit the gas. We're gonna go because that's what society does. And I'm not ready, but I'm just gonna go. And so, and we race into marriage, and we race into advocacy, we race into career, and we race into all this stuff, and we do it so fast. And what if instead of as soon as possible, what if we just stopped? What if we said as slow as possible? And we took the pressure off of ourselves to have to be and have to build and have to create at a lightning pace. We took that pressure off of ourselves. God didn't put that pressure on you. Society's put that pressure on you. We've put that pressure on us. What if we said, you know what? We're not gonna go 100 miles an hour. We're gonna go with a healthy pace. Again, I'm not saying there shouldn't be drive and ambition. I'm not saying that you shouldn't pursue things if you're passionate about things. But maybe if you just got out of a serious relationship, you don't need to jump right into a serious relationship and hit the gas and just go. Slow down. And we could give example after example after example. And I think when we live at a slower pace like that, I think when we're able to step back, it gives us the opportunity to be wise. Because letting impulse and emotion drive the car, it's a recipe for disaster. And what God wants is for us to live in wisdom. So I want to end with a story. Another story from King David. And I'll set this up. King David, so you know, King David is like the king that all the other kings of Israel strive to be. King David was the second king over Israel. The first was a guy named Saul. Now, Saul was appointed king by God to lead God's people, Israel. But there comes sort of an interesting moment where David is told by God, you're going to be the next king. Here's why this is a little different, a little bit interesting, because David isn't a son of Saul. He's not a descendant of Saul. It's a different bloodline. So if you know anything about history, if you know anything about how all this typically works out, a king has a son, that son becomes the next king, okay? This is not that. God is saying, we're just skipping over here to David now. He's going to be the next king. And God makes this clear, and people start to recognize this, and people start to celebrate David as the next king of Israel while Saul is still ruling and still around. So Saul does not like this. He is angered by this. He is on a terror, actually, to kill David. Like, he doesn't care what God says, but he's just like, I'm over it. I'm going to kill you. And so we find ourselves in this place. It's in 1 Samuel 24. You can go home and read it if you'd like. But we find ourselves in this place where David is sort of hiding out. He has like a group of followers, some bandits or whatever you want to call them, and they're actually hiding out in caves because they're running for their lives. And Saul has just finished a battle, and now he's heard word that David is in this certain area, in this certain region. So Saul gets 3,000 men, and they go on this caravan ready to find David and kill David. Now, 3,000 men seems like overkill. I don't know, but nonetheless, this is what happens. So they're on this caravan. There's this line along the path where there's all these different caves, just hundreds and hundreds of caves. Again, David is hiding in one of these caves. Saul, it says in the text, you can go home and read it, Saul actually has this moment where it says he has to relieve himself. He has to go to the bathroom. And so Saul, because he's a king, it's not one of these situations where, like, if you were just whoever, you or me, you could sort of step out, you could go in, you could just do your thing, and then just catch up. Saul, he's the king. So 3,000 people have to stop because Saul has to do number 2, okay? And so Saul, he tries to find a private area. He goes into this cave. And it just happens to be the very cave that David and his men are hiding in. And they see that Saul is sitting there, and he's doing what he's doing, and David's men start to whisper in his ear. They're like, this is the moment. David, this is it, man. This is the moment. Here's what, all right, just get your sword and go kill him. Like God talked about this, that our enemies would be delivered into our hands. This is the moment. And so David, he's got a sword, and he's like creeping up. He's creeping into the cave. Here's Saul, just not aware. He's got his magazine out. He's like, oh, that's interesting. And here's David, and he's coming up on him. And just in this moment, all of a sudden, like this, his conscience hits him. Instead of doing what I think a lot of folks would have done, because imagine how dramatic this would have been. Saul goes into the cave, he does what he has to do, and then in that moment, David just chops his head off, comes out, holds it up in front of the 3,000 men, says, who's your king now? That'd be pretty powerful. Instead, David creeps up on Saul. He cuts just a corner of his robe off. He lets him finish what he's doing. He goes back into the cave. Saul goes back out to his caravan, never knowing that David was even there. And then David is so, even just as he's holding this garment, this piece of his robe, he's so convicted and so challenged, he just says, this whole situation is just messed up. And David walks out of the cave knowing full well that he could be murdered right there, walks out of the cave and says, Saul, hold on a second. And he holds up this piece of robe and he says, listen, I need you to know something. I could have killed you just now, but I didn't want to, because I don't want this to be how this story goes. And I don't want people, when they ask me, hey, how'd it go down? Did you guys have a big brawl? Is there like this huge fight or whatever? And I'd have to be like, no, I chopped his head off while he was pooping. I could have taken a better path, but no, he was just like, I don't want this to be our story. He said, whether it's you or me that's leading Israel, God can sort all that out, but here's the deal, I'm not gonna fight you. Saul is so humbled in this moment. He's so overwhelmed in this moment that he says to David, he says, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I've pitted us against each other. I'm sorry I've tried to kill you. And he shows him mercy. Saul gets back into his caravan, and he goes on his way. See, I think you look at these two stories. You look at what it looks like to live emotionally, impulsively, without boundaries, without guardrails, without having God as the priority so often. And these are ways that we make bad decisions. And I think when you look at David and Bathsheba, it's all urge and impulse and emotion. And then you look at this story, you look at David and Saul and this cave and this moment with this robe. I think it's a story of wisdom. And here's what I notice. I see a lot of heartache, a lot of pain, a lot of anguish in the David and Bathsheba story. And I see a lot of hope, a lot of promise in the David and Saul story. The question is for you and me, what kind of lives do we want to live? What do we want our stories to be? Are we going to fly from one thing to the next and one impulse to the next? Or are we going to be people who say as slow as possible, I just want to be wise? I hope that's where God is leading you today. And you're not going to be perfect at it. But I hope that's the teaching that you'd press into. Father, we love you. We thank you for this day. We thank you for this chance to look in your word. We thank you for the life of David and the example that he was, and we thank you for Solomon, wise Solomon, who says, don't forsake wisdom. Don't turn from wisdom. Don't forget to be wise. God, that's our prayer. Help us not to live with impulse and emotion and lack of accountability, but God, help us to ask, is this wise? Am I being honest with myself? And how can I just walk this life with a healthy pace? God, that's our prayer. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.